This speech was delivered by Davis at the Frontline Feminisms Conference, Women, War, and Resistance.
For those of us who live here in the United States, and perhaps especially in the state of California, this conference can help to provide us with the knowledge and vision we need to cultivate and strengthen our resistance to the cascading conservatism in this state, in this country. A conservatism that unfortunately has already caused many of us to despair. There's a great deal of despair these days, and people tend to look back to other eras and sort of muse about what used to be possible, what we used to be able to accomplish as progressive movements, the presence that the left used to have. So I guess I want to begin by raising the question, how dare we succumb to this defeatism when it is precisely what these campaigns against the rights of immigrants, against affirmative action, campaigns against workers' rights, human rights, it's exactly what they are designed to encourage. So how dare we allow our frustrations and disappointments to immobilize us when women all over the world are resisting, when women in the Balkans and Rwanda are resisting rape and genocide, terror, when women in Korea are fighting for their rights as workers and as women and are demanding to be heard around the involuntary sexual services many women have been forced to offer. How dare we succumb to a sense of defeat when women in Northern Ireland are fighting, continuing to challenge British military occupation, when women in Iran and Algeria are courageously challenging fundamentalism, when women in the Pacific Islands are continuing their decades-long struggle against nuclear tests, when women in South Africa are trying to guarantee the building of a society that is no longer racist, that is not only free of racism, but free of gender discrimination and violence, and free of homophobia as well. And of course, I could go on and on. I could use the entire 45 minutes that has been given me to enumerate the kinds of struggles that are going on all around the world, where women indeed, or women's issues, are now on the front line. But the question I want to come back to is, how dare we think about resigning ourselves to the inevitability of the Pete Wilsons, the Ward Connollys, the Newt Gingriches, and their Democratic fellow travelers. Gatherings like this put things in perspective, don't they? And in this era, when we've witnessed the increased globalization of capitalism and the intrusion of unrestrained capital into people's innermost lives on a global scale. And I want to suggest we forge memories of what it feels like to link our struggles across borders and oceans, because these memories can be later on a palpable source of collective empowerment as we work in the various communities and on the various levels where we have chosen to focus our energies. The global framework within which this conference takes place yields new possibilities of radical consciousness and activism. And in this context, I want to make a brief excursion back into our recent history. I know I just talked about not romanticizing the 60s, and I often shy away from focusing on that era, the late 60s and the early 70s, because there's the tendency to represent many of us who were active during that period as only relevant to that period. And somehow or another, when those movements sort of began to lose their power and force, or even wither away, those of us who were participants in those movements lost our ability to participate in ongoing struggles. I guess what I want to do is take the opportunity to say that almost 25 years after I was acquitted of very serious charges, murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy, 3 capital charges, I want to honor that global movement that was responsible for extricating me from the repressive grip of the state of Richard Nixon, for example. Nixon was president, Reagan was governor. So I want to honor that movement. And I know there are some people here today who are old enough to have participated in some of those movements here in this country and in other parts of the world as well. So I want to honor that movement, of course, for having saved my life, because I wouldn't be here today if it hadn't been for the force of that movement. But I think more importantly, for having dramatically demonstrated the power that global movements promise. And that is, I think, the relevance to today. You know, there's another reason to briefly evoke that historical period. It's true, as I said before, that we need to warn against the tendency to idealize and utopianize the 60s, because this kind of nostalgia can be extremely unproductive. It can have devastating effects on our ability to engage in new and more radical ways of addressing the issues that confront us today. As one who was there, whatever that means, I definitely don't want to return to the backward politics of gender and sexuality, characteristic of that era, which rendered anti-racist movements and anti-colonialist movements incapable of accomplishing their goals. But I do want to point out, particularly for those of you, for the benefit of those of you who may have been born in succeeding generations, there are not too many generations that separate us. And by the way, that's another really wonderful thing about this conference. It's intergenerational character, isn't it? But I do, want to point out that the radical activism of the late 60s and early 70s in Black and Latino, Native American, Asian American communities, among students, among emergent feminist, emergent gay and lesbian activists, emergent environmentalists, the radical activism of that era would have been absolutely inconceivable outside of the international revolutionary context within which it occurred. The decolonization of the continent of Africa, the Cuban Revolution, the courageous struggle waged by the Vietnamese people against U.S. imperialist aggression. And of course, women across racial and ethnic lines here in this country were especially inspired by the women who participated in those global revolutionary challenges. I remember the way in which Algerian women were depicted as the fearless champions of the Algerian revolution. We watched Battle of Algiers over and over and over again. And of course, we know now that the situation in Algeria does not reflect what many of us felt, was a revolutionary gender approach as well. South African women like Dorothy Inyebe, who risked their lives to challenge apartheid's past laws. Cuban women were evoked. Women like Aide Santa Maria, who was involved in the launching of the Cuban Revolution. Vietnamese women like Madame Ben, who fought bravely against the U.S. military. The attachments many women felt with international male revolutionary figures like Che or Fidel. But I'm going to leave it at that. I won't do an analysis of that right now. But I guess I would say that however complicated that era may have been, the radical will to bring about structural, social, economic, political transformation was inextricably linked to a sense of international community. Now, today, transnational linkages among progressive and radical movements are much more than a question of inspiration, much more than a question of identification, much more than a question of style. These transnational linkages are a question of necessity. There is no other way to confront exploitation, violence, war. The issues of this conference revolves around how to create those transnational linkages in feminist contexts in ways that are respectful of all participants. As many activists and scholars, Chandra Mohanty for one, have pointed out, sisterhood is not a given. Sisterhood is not a given. If such a possibility exists, it is certainly not grounded in some universal notion of femaleness, of womanness. When gender alone becomes the ticket for membership, now first of all, we end up with some very strange bedfellows, or should I say bed sisters. And second of all, this sisterhood will more than likely be hierarchically structured. There are big sisters, there are little sisters, and then there are baby sisters. I don't think I have to spell out who inhabits which positions in this hierarchy. The point I would like to make is that female or feminist transnational connections need to be politically grounded. Feminist transnational connections need to be politically grounded and informed by the real work women and men are doing around the world. Which brings me to some of the specific points I'd like to make about one struggle that could greatly benefit from increased transnational linkages. If there's one lesson women in the West or in the North should have learned from women's struggles in the Third World, in the South, it is that an equal rights framework does not work, particularly since the status of males is not exactly the emancipation women in these countries seek. Now, not long ago, couple of months ago in September, I believe, I came across a picture in the New York Times, the cover of the New York Times, I think it was. It was a picture of 3 women prisoners in Phoenix, Arizona. Some of you probably saw that picture. The photograph foregrounded their combat boots, and their combat boots were linked together by chains. Under the picture, there was this caption, a chain gang of women, and this was the text. The nation's first female chain gang began work yesterday, picking up trash and pulling weeds in downtown Phoenix. The 15 women were chained at the ankles in groups of 5. The sheriffs, well, you probably know about Sheriff Joe Arpaio, right? The meanest, what do they call him? The meanest sheriff in the country or something like that. Anyway, his comment was, and I quote, "I don't believe in discrimination in my jail system." So this female chain gang was designed to be an expression of the equality women have earned. If there are male chain gangs, then women should also have the right to work on chain gangs. I think that's clear that to formulate such questions within what some of us might call a bourgeois democratic equal rights framework often creates more problems than it solves. In this particular instance, of course, this call for equal rights for women prisoners only reinforces the punishment industry. And just a little bit about the U.S. punishment industry. The U.S. prison industrial complex. The United States presently boasts of the highest rate of incarceration in the world. The highest rate of incarceration in the world. But what is often ignored, even by those who acknowledge the dangers of committing vast numbers of youth from communities of color to jails and prisons, and you may know that over 40% of young, well, in the state of California, something like 75% of all young black men have been arrested at one time or another. At one time or another. And on any given day, about 42% of young black men are in the criminal justice system. In the nation, about 1/3, 32% of all young black men are either in jail, in prison, or on probation or parole. Now, what's often ignored is that populations of women prisoners are growing at a rate that far surpasses the populations of imprisoned men. The gender dimension of state-inflicted punishment is so frequently overlooked because of the comparatively small percentage of women behind bars. There are about 100,000 women in prison within the U.S. This amounts to about 7.5, 7.6% of the total jail and prison population. But since 1980, the imprisoned female population has increased by 275%. While the male population has increased by 160%. Moreover, and think about this seriously, during the decade of the 1980s, 34 new women's prisons were either constructed or created, as compared to 17 during the 1970s and 7 during the 1960s. There used to be one women's prison in the state of California. Now they're building prisons across the street from prisons. Across the street from Chowchilla, is that prison they call Valley State. Yeah. Now, during the last century, feminist approaches to women in prison consisted largely in demanding separate and specifically feminine incarceration regimes. As a matter of fact, women relegated to the penitentiary were considered to be fallen women. The fact that they were accused of committing crimes was not as important as the fact that they were assumed to have violated the ethics of their gender roles. Therefore, women's prisons, as they were demanded by the feminist reformers, should rehabilitate them in the sense of teaching them how to be good wives, good mothers, good domestic servants, teaching them how to cook, how to sew, how to keep house. And part of this is still very much a part of the prison system today. By the way, I can tell you about some of the experiences I had. But later the emphasis shifted to this fight for the equal rights of women prisoners. And in a sense, tactically, it does make sense in a range of situations. It seems absurd that we should have to argue for gender equality within such an institution as the prison system, which is designed to dehumanize and destroy women and men, when there's situations such as the lack of medical facilities. Valley State, which I mentioned, you'll remember, is a facility that does not even have a medical room. It doesn't have an infirmary. It has no permanent physician. And as a matter of fact, in Northern California, there are very interesting movements that have developed, organized by the California Coalition for Women in Prison, demanding health rights, and specifically looking at women with HIV. But what I want to emphasize today is not so much that equal rights tactical move that we sometimes are compelled to make. When I was in jail, women did not have the right to exercise. I was one of the many jails I was in, Marin County. There was a huge exercise for men, but none for women. So we went to court, and on behalf of all of the women who were imprisoned there, to demand that women be able to use the exercise yard. And that's something, of course, we take that for granted. But I can tell you, after being in that prison, for that jail for many, many months, it made a big difference whether I could go outside or not. They finally allowed the women there to exercise together, and then I exercised alone. They wouldn't allow me to go out with the rest of the women. I was in solitary confinement for that entire period. But I appreciated the fresh air and some space to do my karate katas as well. What I want to emphasize now, however, is the fact that the expanding prison space for women is an integral part of what we can call the prison industrial complex. We therefore need to develop feminist strategies of challenging this prison industrial complex in ways that simultaneously address the specific needs of the individual women whose lives are violated. And we're talking about on an international scale, by violence, by torture, by quotidian regimes of dehumanization. We need to develop feminist strategies that move toward radical structural transformation as well. One of the problems with many movements, and I mentioned the prison movement, but there's the homeless movement as well, is that many of us tend to get caught up into service strategies. And services are extremely important. But a service approach does not prohibit you, from also thinking about the ways in which this institutionalized poverty and institutionalized punishment link up with transnational global capitalism today. Capitalism is a word that people don't use very much anymore. Have you noticed that? Have you noticed that at a time when capital is becoming increasingly global and in which we can see more clearly the impact of capitalism on people's lives? I mean, look at the extent to which immigration in this country is very much informed by migrating corporations. You see what I mean? Why don't we talk about, why are we so afraid to talk about capitalism? Do we buy into the fact that because the socialism that once existed in Eastern Europe is no longer there, does that mean that that capitalism has won the battle? Do we really believe that? Well, I just want to suggest that we think about ways of radicalizing our strategic approaches to organizing. And activists and academics have to come together to figure out, some of these things. And I want to suggest, and I've been talking about this for quite some time, some of you, I'm sure, have heard me refer to this before, is, I want to suggest that with respect to prisons, for example, we need to begin to take seriously abolitionist strategies designed to reduce and ultimately abolish the role that prisons play in relation to social problems like poverty and racism and violence. The term prison industrial complex is an important one to popularize. Just as some of you will remember, during the era of the Vietnam War, the term military industrial complex, which had a certain currency prior to that period, going back to the 50s, right? But it was during the late 60s and the early 70s that it acquired popular currency, that organizers and activists began to conceptualize the military industrial complex, sometimes granted in a conspiratorial way, and there probably were some conspiracies here and there. But just as it was important then, it is important now to find ways of developing popular consciousness regarding the connections between corporate capitalism, the rise of a military industry that absorbed and continues to absorb the resources we desperately need to combat poverty and homelessness, a deteriorated educational system, a privatized and increasingly inaccessible healthcare system, and racism and domestic violence, and we could go on and on. The U.S. military industry ought to be disestablished now. Shut down the Pentagon. What was once considered to be this major communist threat. That's how I ended up in the situation, that I found myself in 1969, because I was one of the embodiments of the communist threat. But this communist threat, it doesn't exist anymore. So, why is it that the military industry continues to grow? Boeing, for example, and its takeover bid of McDonnell Douglas. This is an indication of the extent to which the military industrial complex persists in exerting its influence not only on the U.S. economy, but Boeing has a presence in virtually every state in the country. There was an article in the last issue of The Nation, and they pointed out that Boeing plays a key role in developing congressional support, for example, for sales of AWACS radar planes to Saudi Arabia, for most favored nation status for China, and it's possible that in battles over whether to sell weapons and weapon technologies to countries like Indonesia and Turkey, this Boeing-McDonnell combined can play a pivotal role in convincing the government to forget about human rights concerns and weapons proliferation treaties and strategies. Well, this prison industrial complex that I've been talking about has joined and to a certain extent is beginning to displace the military industrial complex. There are many ways in which the proliferation of prisons is directly related to the rise of transnational capitalism. First of all, how are such large prison populations, or potential prisons populations, created? Where do they come from? There's a direct relationship between the deindustrialization of the U.S. economy, the ability of corporations now to move wherever they wish without respecting any national borders in search of the cheapest labor, and of course the loss of jobs in this country, particularly for certain kinds of people, particularly for young people of color. And when those jobs disappear, when that economy deteriorates, new economies move in. The drug economy, for example, moves right in to take the place of for example, the automobile economy. Look at a place like Detroit. The economy in sexual services. And of course, those economies lead the people who participate in them directly into the criminal justice system. So there's that connection between transnational capitalism and the rise of this out-of-control prison industrial complex. Well, there's a corporation that is called Corrections Corporation of America. And as I mentioned before, they actually have an interlocking directorate with the Hospitals Corporations of America. And obviously the privatization of key areas of the, what I call the punishment industry makes sense only if it's profitable. I mean, this is why it's so important to talk about a prison industrial complex, because there are stakes in this expanding prison industry that go a lot deeper than we would imagine. And it's not only the privatization of certain prisons and prison systems in certain states, it's the insinuation of private industries into state government-controlled prisons as well. As a matter of fact, California, since we're here in this state, has what it calls a joint venture program, which lures or encourages corporations to use the labor of prisoners. And you see, in a sense, what's happening is that the third world labor pools that corporations seek when they shut down here and move to countries like Mexico, countries like Korea, etc., that pool is going to be complemented by a pool of very cheap labor right here in the U.S., prison labor. And if you look at some of the literature that the California Corrections Department puts out, it encourages businesses to come in and use the labor of the prison system because, first of all, it's cheap labor, right? No minimum wage, no benefits, and they point out that their employees won't have the problems that other employees have, won't have problems finding babysitters, won't have problems in terms of traffic because they're right there. They don't have to worry about vacation pay, etc. So there's this sort of conscious attempt to bring, corporate businesses into the prison system. But I want to say also that, and I often try to include this into my talks on prison because we often don't think about the ideological role that prisons play and the way in which the emphasis on crime and incarceration and prisons encourages us to think about these prisons as abstract sites. Most of us, if we haven't been in prison or if we don't have relatives in prison, we don't have some connection, we rarely think about what prisons are like concretely. The concept prison remains very much an abstract concept into which undesirables are deposited, right? So that we don't have to think about the real issues that afflict the communities from which prisoners are drawn in such disproportionate numbers. This is the ideological work that prison performs. It relieves us of the responsibility of seriously engaging with the problems of late capitalism, of transnational capitalism. The punishment industry, which is becoming also increasingly privatized, in that sense it's following the healthcare industry. And as a matter of fact, there's an interlocking directorate between some major corporations, corrections corporations, hospital corporations. Prisons are also gradually moving into spaces vacated by migrant corporations, also moving into spaces vacated by the military industry. As a matter of fact, there was a conference a couple of years ago entitled Law Enforcement Technology in the 21st Century that was sponsored by the research arm of the Justice Department. And the theme of the conference was to figure out how the defense industry could be converted to a law enforcement industry. For example, they talked about Stinger Corporation working on, quote, smart guns, which will fire only for the owner, and retractable spike barrier strips to unfurl in front of fleeing vehicles. Westinghouse was promoting a smart car in which the many computers could be linked up with big mainframes at the police department, allowing for the speedy booking of prisoners as well as exchanges of information. I mean, the kinds of products that they were talking about developing as a way of converting the military industry into a so-called law enforcement industry is really frightening. Really frightening. Because we're talking about an out-of-control proliferation of incarcerated populations. And why here in the U.S. are we so reluctant to stand up and fight back? Why? One of the reasons is because I think we're all afraid. We're afraid of the figure of the criminal that is created in order to justify the expansion of this punishment industry. And many of us who do feminist work don't acknowledge the extent to which women are being demonized in this process, and the extent to which the assault on welfare and the dismantling of the welfare system is a part of a process of increasingly demonizing women, certain kinds of women, who are increasingly inhabiting these new prison spaces. I mean, that's the connection. The connection between the demonization of immigrants from Central America and Asia and the demonization of young people of color who are presented as criminals. It's very much connected. And I think that feminist strategies, which are supposed to be based on acknowledging connections, right? And intersections and interlocking of, the terminology we use. Why can't we begin to use some of those strategies to unveil, some of the connections that ought to be so obvious to us, but which we almost always ignore? So I guess what I'm suggesting is that we connect forms of activism, such as work around women prisoners, women's prisons, that we connect these with radical contestations of capitalism, radical resistance to capitalism. That's the theme of this conference. And on an international scale, there is an incredible amount of work that can be done around issues of women in prison, women's prisons, women political prisoners. There is work that is being done now. There's very important work that is being done. But there's the tendency to focus almost exclusively on issues of how the children of incarcerated women are affected by their imprisonment. And while this is extremely important, because we know that children, often bear much of the brunt of that process, we can't erase women's lives. We can't argue. We can't create this hierarchy of interests in which we argue that the interests of the children come first, and then the interests of the woman constructed as mother come second. And this is a real challenge within the international movement around women's prison issues. How do we address issues of the way in which the prison tends to destroy relationships between mother and child, without allowing this conservative ideology of family values to insinuate itself into the work that we do? So I would like to close by acknowledging the presence of such large numbers of women political prisoners throughout the world, here in the U.S. and all over the world. And since we're in the state of California, I'd like to mention Dilcia Pagan and all of the Puerto Rican political prisoners who have been in the federal prison system for over 15 years. And perhaps many of you know the name of Mumia Abu Jamal. I'd like to evoke his presence amidst our gathering, women like Laura Whitehorn. I will never forget when I was in jail myself, how moved I felt on a number of occasions when I received messages and presents from people who were in dungeons in other parts of the world. I remember a message I received from political prisoners in Greece who had smuggled out this some kind of toilet paper, with a message of solidarity to me on it. And I felt, I don't deserve all of this. There are so many other political prisoners and prisoners all over the world who need that solidarity, that commitment. And I guess 25 years later, I find that my sense of wanting to participate in expanding movements around political prisoners and prisoners has not diminished. As a matter of fact, I think that now, given the conditions around the globe, we need to build these movements more than ever before. And if we organize these international solidarity movements with women political prisoners, if we politicize and radicalize our work against prisons, then perhaps we may be able to radicalize vast sectors of our movements throughout the globe. I want to leave on a rather optimistic note when I leave this conference, and I hope that many of you agree with me that it is still possible to bring about change in the world and here in the U.S. Thank you very much.